Before we begin today's story, I have a question for you. Have you ever judged someone by the value of their gift, only to discover later that it meant far more than money could ever buy? Today's story is about a simple homemade gift that made everyone laugh until they uncovered the heartbreaking truth hidden inside it. What seemed like the cheapest present at the party turned out to be the most priceless gift of all, and the secret behind it changed everyone's lives forever. Stay with us until the very end, because the final reveal is something you'll never expect. And before we start, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Glow Show in Europe, Africa, please tell us in the comments. Which country are you watching this story from? We enjoy reading your comments and seeing viewers from all around the world. Now, let's begin. Margaret's retirement celebration was the biggest event the small town had seen in years. The community hall was filled with soft music, fresh flowers, and warm lights hanging from the ceiling. Long tables were covered with white cloths, and every chair was occupied by someone whose life had been touched by her kindness. Former students had traveled from nearby cities and distant towns just to be there. Some had taken time off from work, while others had brought their families so they could meet the woman who had changed their lives. Laughter echoed through the room as old classmates reunited after many years, sharing memories of school days and stories about how Margaret had inspired them. She stood near the stage, greeting each guest with the same gentle smile that had welcomed generations of children into her library. For 40 years, Margaret had served as the town's librarian. She was never the loudest person in the room, and she never sought attention or praise. Instead, she quietly devoted her life to helping children discover books that matched their dreams. She remembered their favorite stories, encouraged nervous readers, and always believed that every child deserved a chance to succeed. Many people credited her for their love of learning, while others said she had been the first adult who truly listened to them. Tonight, they wanted to thank her in the best way they knew how. As the evening continued, guests lined up to present their retirement gifts. Beautiful boxes wrapped in shiny paper piled higher and higher on the table beside the stage. One former student gave her an expensive gold watch engraved with her name. Another presented a luxury handbag that drew admiring whispers from the crowd. Someone else offered a large painting of the old library where Margaret had spent most of her career. There were elegant flower arrangements, fine jewelry, gift cards, and heartfelt speeches. Each gift reflected success, wealth, and gratitude, and every presentation was greeted with applause. Near the back, Margaret never joined the laughter. She held the package carefully, almost protectively, and thanked Daniel once again before placing it gently beside the other gifts instead of pushing it aside. She noticed the careful folds in the brown paper and the hand-tied ribbon, sensing that someone had invested time rather than money into what rested inside the small box. Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the guests had returned to their homes, Margaret carried all of her retirement gifts into her quiet living room. The house felt unusually peaceful after the excitement of the party. She placed the beautifully wrapped boxes on a large wooden table and slowly removed her shoes, smiling as she remembered the heartfelt speeches and warm hugs she had received. Every gift represented appreciation from someone whose life she had touched, and she intended to open each one carefully. Yet as she looked across the table, her eyes kept returning to the smallest package wrapped in plain brown paper. It was Daniel's gift. Unlike the expensive boxes covered in colorful ribbons, this one seemed almost humble, but something about it quietly drew her attention. She gently untied the handmade ribbon instead of cutting it. The brown paper unfolded neatly, revealing a carefully crafted wooden box underneath. Margaret immediately noticed that it was not bought from a store. Every corner had been carved by hand, and the natural grain of the wood had been polished until it felt smooth beneath her fingertips. Tiny imperfections in the carving showed that someone had spent many hours shaping it with patience rather than machines. On the lid were 4 carefully engraved words. "For the woman who saved me." Margaret stared at the message for several long seconds. Her breathing slowed, and a strange feeling settled over her. The words felt deeply personal. She gently traced each letter with her fingers before lifting the lid. Inside, she found dozens of small folded papers arranged in perfect rows. Each one was neatly folded and marked with a handwritten date. At first, she wasn't sure what they were. Curious, she unfolded the oldest note. It read, September 12th. Today I wanted to disappear, but you smiled and asked if I had eaten lunch. Margaret blinked in surprise. She unfolded another. September 29th. You told me that every story deserves to be finished, including mine. Another note followed. October 3rd. You stayed after school just to help me finish one chapter, because you believed I could. She continued opening them one by one. November 14th. Everyone else walked past me today. You noticed I wasn't smiling. December 18th. You gave me my first book and said stories could become doors. With every note she opened, memories that had been buried beneath decades slowly returned. She remembered Daniel as a quiet little boy who almost never raised his hand in class. While other children laughed together during breaks, he often sat alone in the corner of the library pretending to read. Many teachers believed he simply lacked confidence or interest in school, but Margaret had always sensed something different. His silence was not laziness. It was loneliness. Over time, she had learned pieces of his life, without asking too many questions. Daniel lived with his mother, who suffered from a serious illness that left her unable to work regularly. Before coming to school each morning, he prepared breakfast, cleaned the house, and made sure she had her medicine. By the time classes began, he was already exhausted. His clothes were often worn and too small because buying new ones was impossible for the family. Sometimes he came to school without lunch, quietly pretending he wasn't hungry. Margaret had never wanted Daniel to feel embarrassed. Instead of announcing that he needed help, she found quiet ways to support him. She arranged for extra lunches through the school cafeteria without revealing where they came from. Whenever old library books were being replaced, she told Daniel he could keep them because they were no longer needed, even though she had specifically chosen books she thought he would love. She encouraged him to borrow novels, biographies, and history books, believing that reading could give him hope beyond his difficult circumstances. Sometimes Daniel stayed after school just to sit in the library. He rarely talked, but Margaret never forced conversations. She simply allowed him to exist in a safe place where nobody judged him. Occasionally, she would recommend a new book or ask his opinion about a character. Little by little, the shy boy began speaking more. His confidence grew through stories before it grew in real life. Margaret had never considered these moments extraordinary. To her, they were simply part of caring for a student. She had helped many children over the years, and as time passed, individual memories naturally faded. Yet Daniel had remembered every single act of kindness. He had written each memory on the day it happened, preserving emotions that Margaret herself had long forgotten. She continued reading. January 8th. Today you said being poor doesn't decide who I become. February 21st. You believed me when nobody else did. April 4th. You told me that courage is choosing tomorrow even when today hurts. The notes were not long, but each one carried enormous emotion. They revealed the private struggles of a lonely child and the quiet influence of one caring adult. Margaret realized she had unknowingly become Daniel's source of hope during the darkest years of his life. At the bottom of the wooden box rested a larger envelope, separate from the smaller notes. Its paper looked newer, and Daniel's handwriting appeared steadier than it had been years earlier. Margaret carefully opened it and unfolded a handwritten letter. Daniel explained that after leaving school, life had remained difficult for several years. His mother's illness worsened, and after her passing, he was left completely alone. There were times when he considered giving up on his dreams because the future seemed impossible. Yet whenever he felt hopeless, he reread the little notes he had written about Margaret's encouragement. They reminded him that at least one person had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. The letter described how those memories gave him the strength to continue studying, earn scholarships, and slowly build a successful career. He admitted that many people congratulated him for his achievements, but almost nobody knew the real reason he had refused to quit. According to Daniel, every success he had earned began with the kindness Margaret had shown a frightened child who believed he had been forgotten by the world. Near the end of the letter, he revealed that he had carved the wooden box himself over several months because purchasing an expensive present never felt meaningful enough. A store-bought gift could be replaced, but something created with his own hands carried a part of his gratitude inside it. Every carved line represented a memory. Every polished surface reflected the patience Margaret had once shown him. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she finished reading. She carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the box. Then she noticed something she had missed earlier. Beneath the stack of notes was a small velvet pouch. Curious, she lifted it gently and discovered a tiny brass key resting inside. Attached to the key was a handwritten tag with only a few simple words that immediately filled her with curiosity and quiet anticipation. The next morning, Margaret woke up much earlier than usual. She had barely slept because Daniel's letter and the small brass key remained on her mind throughout the night. She kept wondering what the key was for and why he had asked her to come to the old library. After getting dressed, she carefully placed the wooden box back on her table and slipped the key into her coat pocket. As she left her house, the morning air felt cool and fresh, and the quiet streets reminded her of the many mornings she had walked to work during her years as the town librarian. The old library stood on the edge of town, hidden behind rows of tall maple trees. Years earlier, it had been the heart of the community, filled with children searching for adventure between the pages of books. But after a newer building had opened across town, the old library had slowly been forgotten. Budget cuts eventually forced it to close, and for nearly 10 years it had remained empty. The windows had become dusty, the paint had faded, and wooden boards covered parts of the entrance to keep people away. Margaret had often driven past it with sadness, remembering the laughter that once filled its halls. As she approached the building, something immediately seemed different. The old wooden boards had been removed from the front entrance. Workers were cleaning the sidewalks, arranging flower pots near the steps, and polishing the windows until they sparkled in the morning sunlight. Fresh flowers lined the pathway leading to the front door, and colorful ribbons decorated the entrance. It no longer looked abandoned. Instead, it looked as though it had been brought back to life. Margaret stopped in surprise. She looked around, trying to understand what was happening. Before she could ask anyone, Daniel stepped out from inside the building. He greeted her with a warm smile, looking far more relaxed than he had during the retirement party. "I'm glad you came," he said. Margaret smiled back. "What is all this?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the large wooden door. "Do you still have the key?" She reached into her pocket and held up the small brass key. "I do. I'd like you to open the door." Margaret looked confused. The old library had always used large iron keys, not a tiny brass one. Still, she walked toward the entrance. Near the handle, she noticed a brand new lock that hadn't existed before. She carefully inserted the key. It fit perfectly. With a gentle turn, the lock clicked open. Daniel slowly pushed the heavy door inward. Margaret stepped inside. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. The dusty, forgotten library, she remembered, had completely disappeared. Bright sunlight poured through clean windows, filling every corner with warmth. Fresh wooden shelves stretched across the room, each one neatly filled with books of every kind. Comfortable chairs surrounded reading tables where children quietly turned pages with excited smiles. One corner featured colorful rugs where younger children listened to volunteers reading stories aloud. Another section held modern computers with students researching school projects. Large green plants decorated the space, giving the building a peaceful and welcoming atmosphere. The familiar smell of old dust had been replaced by the comforting scent of polished wood and fresh paper. Margaret slowly walked through the room, touching the bookshelves with disbelief. Everything had been restored while preserving the charm of the original building she had loved so much. Even the old wooden staircase had been carefully repaired instead of replaced. Then she noticed a large sign hanging above the main reading room. Margaret Community Learning Center. She stopped walking. Her eyes filled with tears. "My name," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "This place belongs to everyone now. But it carries your name because none of it would exist without you." Margaret turned toward him, still struggling to understand. "You built all of this?" Daniel smiled gently. "Not alone. He explained that after becoming a successful architect, he had quietly returned to his hometown several years earlier. Every time he passed the abandoned library, he remembered the afternoons he had spent there as a frightened child. Seeing the building empty had always saddened him because it represented the place where his life had first begun to change. Instead of letting the building disappear forever, he secretly purchased it after learning it would soon be demolished. Using his own savings, he hired local construction workers, invited volunteers from the community, and worked alongside them whenever he had free time. They repaired the roof, restored the floors, replaced broken windows, and rebuilt every room while carefully preserving the building's original character. For 2 years, they worked quietly. Daniel told almost no one about the project. Even many volunteers believed the completed building would simply become another public library. Only a few people knew the real purpose. Margaret listened in complete silence as he continued explaining. The new learning center would offer free books to families who could not afford them. Children would receive tutoring after school without paying a single dollar. Adults could attend evening classes to improve their reading, writing, or computer skills. Students preparing for college would have internet access, study rooms, and mentors willing to help them achieve their dreams. Elderly residents could gather for book clubs, storytelling events, and community activities that would keep the building full of life every day. "This isn't just a library anymore," Daniel said quietly. "It's a place where nobody gets left behind." Margaret looked around again. Children laughed softly as they shared books together. Volunteers patiently helped teenagers with homework. Parents sat reading beside their young sons and daughters. The building had become far more than shelves filled with books. It had become a home for learning, hope, and opportunity. Daniel noticed her watching a young boy sitting alone with a novel. "He reminds me of myself," Daniel said. Margaret smiled gently. "I was thinking exactly the same thing." The boy looked shy and uncertain, just as Daniel once had. But unlike years ago, he now sat in a room filled with people ready to encourage him whenever he needed help. Margaret slowly turned toward Daniel. "You've created something extraordinary." Daniel shook his head. "No. You started it years ago." She looked at him with surprise. "When you gave one lonely child a safe place to belong, you planted the first seed. Everything you see here grew from that moment." Margaret lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that simple acts she barely remembered had continued changing lives long after she believed they were forgotten. As they continued walking through the building, Daniel showed her classrooms, reading spaces, and quiet study areas. Every room had been designed to make learning feel welcoming instead of intimidating. Local artists had painted colorful murals celebrating imagination and kindness. Shelves contained books donated by former students, teachers, and families from across the country. Volunteers greeted Margaret warmly, thanking her for inspiring the project even though many of them had never met her before. Just as Margaret thought the morning could not possibly become more emotional, she heard the sound of several cars arriving outside. One after another, people began stepping through the entrance, carrying small wooden boxes identical to the one Daniel had given her, and she immediately realized another unexpected surprise was waiting just beyond the doorway. Margaret stood quietly near the entrance of the learning center as more and more people walked through the front doors. The sound of friendly conversations filled the room, mixed with the laughter of children reading nearby. At first, she assumed the visitors had simply come to celebrate the opening of the building. But as each person entered, she noticed something unusual. Every one of them carried a small wooden box almost identical to the one Daniel had given her the previous evening. The boxes were handcrafted, polished by hand, and engraved with the same careful attention to detail. She looked at Daniel with confusion, but he simply smiled, inviting her to wait a little longer. Within a few minutes, the main reading room was filled with people of different ages and professions. Some wore business suits, while others arrived in medical uniforms or work clothes. There were teachers, engineers, artists, police officers, firefighters, nurses, business owners, and community leaders. They greeted one another warmly, many recognizing old classmates they had not seen for years. Despite their different careers and backgrounds, they all shared one thing in common. Every face turned toward Margaret with deep respect and gratitude. Daniel stepped forward and gently raised his hand for everyone's attention. "Margaret," he said with a warm smile, "I'd like you to meet a few of your former students." She looked around the room with surprise. "So many of you came?" A young woman wearing a doctor's white coat smiled. "We wouldn't have missed this day for anything." Another man, dressed in a firefighter's uniform, nodded. "You changed our lives long before we understood what you were doing." Margaret felt overwhelmed. She recognized some faces immediately, while others had changed so much over the years that she could hardly believe they had once been children sitting in her library. Before she could speak, Daniel invited everyone to gather in a circle. "I think it's time," he said softly. One by one, the former students stepped forward. The first speaker was the young doctor. "When I was 12, she began, "my family couldn't afford the registration fee for an important science competition. I thought I had to give up. A few days later, someone anonymously paid the fee. I didn't discover until years later that it was you." Margaret looked surprised. "I never wanted anyone to know." The doctor smiled. "That's exactly why it meant so much." Next came a middle-aged teacher. "I struggled with reading more than anyone else in my class. Other students laughed whenever I stumbled over simple words. Every afternoon you stayed after school and read with me until I stopped being afraid of books. Today I teach children who face the same fears." The room applauded quietly. Then a police officer stepped forward. "I lost my father when I was very young. I became angry at the world and got into trouble often. Everyone expected me to become another failure. But you were the only adult who asked why I was hurting instead of punishing me for it. You reminded me that good people sometimes make mistakes." Those words changed everything. Margaret listened with tears filling her eyes. She had never realized how many small moments had remained alive in the hearts of her students. Another woman approached. She owned a successful business. "My family couldn't buy winter boots one year. I remember finding a new pair in my school locker with no note attached. I knew it wasn't an accident. Years later, one of the school staff quietly confirmed it was you." Margaret smiled gently. "I hoped they would fit." "They fit perfectly," the woman replied. "But more importantly, they made me feel like someone cared." As more people shared their memories, a pattern slowly became clear. None of Margaret's acts had been grand or dramatic. She had never made speeches about kindness or asked for recognition. She simply noticed when someone needed help and acted quietly without expecting anything in return. She bought school supplies for children whose families struggled financially. Each story seemed small by itself. Together, they painted the picture of a woman whose quiet compassion had shaped an entire generation. Margaret covered her mouth as she listened. "I don't even remember doing some of these things." Daniel smiled. "That's because to you, they were ordinary." The room became silent. "But to us," he continued, "they became turning points." Daniel then invited everyone to place their wooden boxes on a large table in the center of the room. As Margaret looked closely, she noticed each box contained handwritten letters, memories, and photographs collected over many years. Every former student had created their own version of Daniel's gift, preserving moments when Margaret had changed their lives without realizing it. The boxes represented dozens of personal stories, yet they all shared one message. One caring adult had believed in children who had nearly lost hope. Daniel walked toward a covered display near the wall. "I have one more thing to show you." He gently removed the cloth. Behind it stood a large plaque. Across the top were engraved the words, "The Margaret Promise." Margaret looked at him with curiosity. "What is this?" Daniel explained that many of her former students had stayed in touch over the years. Although they lived in different cities and countries, they never forgot the kindness they had received during childhood. Together, they decided that the best way to honor Margaret was not by buying expensive gifts, but by helping future generations. Several years earlier, they had quietly created a scholarship fund. Every year, former students contributed whatever they could afford. Some donated large amounts. Others gave only a little. No contribution was considered more important than another. The fund had already helped hundreds of children pay for school supplies, college tuition, books, tutoring, and educational opportunities they otherwise could not afford. Margaret stared at the plaque in disbelief. "You've been doing this all these years?" Daniel nodded. "And nobody wanted credit." Another former student smiled. "We all agreed on one rule. No scholarship would ever carry our names." Margaret looked at them with tears streaming down her face. "So, whose name does it carry?" Everyone answered together. "Yours." The room filled with warm applause. At that very moment, several guests from the retirement party entered the learning center after hearing about the special event. They were the same people who had laughed when Daniel presented his plain homemade gift. As they walked inside, they saw the restored building, the gathered former students, the scholarship plaque, and the dozens of handcrafted memory boxes arranged across the table. The laughter they had shared only a day earlier disappeared, replaced by stunned silence as they finally understood that what they had dismissed as the cheapest gift in the room had actually carried a lifetime of gratitude, sacrifice, and a legacy that money could never buy. The room remained silent long after the applause faded. No one seemed eager to speak because every person present was still thinking about everything they had witnessed. Margaret stood beside the table filled with handcrafted wooden boxes, each one holding memories from former students whose lives had been changed by her quiet acts of kindness. She never imagined that the simple decisions she had made throughout her career would leave such a lasting impact. To her, helping children had never been about receiving praise or recognition. It had simply been the right thing to do. Daniel slowly walked toward the wooden box he had given Margaret the night before. He lifted it carefully from the table and smiled as he looked at the people gathered around him. Every face reflected a different emotion. Some were smiling through tears, while others quietly held the hands of family members standing beside them. Even the guests who had laughed at the homemade gift during the retirement celebration now looked embarrassed by their earlier judgment. Daniel gently placed the box in front of Margaret. "There is one last thing I want to show you," he said. Margaret looked at him with curiosity. "I thought I had already seen everything." Daniel smiled. "Not quite." He carefully removed the stack of folded notes from inside the wooden box. Then he reached toward the bottom and pressed lightly against one corner. A hidden wooden panel quietly slid open, revealing a small secret compartment that Margaret had never noticed before. Inside rested a single tiny seed. It looked ordinary, almost too small to attract attention. Margaret carefully picked it up between her fingers. "A seed?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Attached to the seed was a small handwritten card. Margaret unfolded it and slowly read the words aloud. "Kindness is like this seed. Alone it seems small, but planted in the right heart, it becomes a forest." As she finished reading, complete silence filled the room once again. The simple message carried more meaning than anyone expected. The tiny seed represented every quiet act of kindness Margaret had shown over the years. At the time, each act seemed small and almost forgettable. A conversation with a lonely child, a donated book, a paid school fee, a warm meal, a pair of winter boots. None of those moments appeared important on their own. Yet together they had grown into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. Daniel looked around the room before speaking. "When I was a child, I thought you only helped me." He smiled toward the other former students. "But later I realized every person standing here has their own story." The doctor nodded. "So, do I." The firefighters smiled. "And me." One after another, people quietly agreed. Daniel continued. "We are all branches of the same tree." He paused for a moment. "And that tree grew from seeds you planted without expecting anything in return." Margaret wiped away another tear. "I never planned any of this." "I know," Daniel replied. "That's what makes it real." He explained that genuine kindness rarely announces itself. It doesn't seek applause or rewards. It often happens through simple moments that most people forget by the next day. Yet for someone struggling with fear, loneliness, or hopelessness, those moments can become life-changing memories that remain forever. The guests from the retirement party who had mocked Daniel's homemade gift quietly stepped forward. One elderly man lowered his head before speaking. "I owe you an apology." Daniel smiled kindly. "There is no need." The man shook his head. We judged your gift before understanding its meaning. A woman standing beside him added, we saw cheap wrapping paper instead of priceless memories. Daniel looked at both of them with kindness rather than anger. Sometimes we all make that mistake. He explained that people often measure value by appearance. Expensive gifts attract attention because their worth can easily be seen. Handmade gifts, however, often hide something that cannot be measured by money. They carry time, effort, love, patience, and memories that no store can sell. Margaret listened quietly as the conversation continued. Looking around the room, she realized that every successful adult standing before her had once been a frightened child searching for encouragement. Some had become doctors who now saved lives every day. Others had become teachers who inspired new generations of students. There were engineers building safer communities, artists creating beauty, police officers protecting families, and volunteers serving neighbors in need. None of them had followed exactly the same path, yet each carried one lesson forward. Whenever they met someone struggling, they chose compassion instead of judgment because someone had once shown that same compassion to them. Daniel then invited everyone to walk outside together. The morning sunlight filled the small garden beside the entrance of the learning center. Birds sang from nearby trees, and children playing in the distance filled the air with joyful laughter. Daniel handed Margaret a small gardening shovel. I think this belongs to you. She smiled. What am I planting? The future. Together they dug a small hole beside the front steps of the learning center. Margaret gently placed the tiny seed into the ground before covering it with fresh soil. Daniel poured water over the spot while the gathered crowd watched in complete silence. No speeches followed. No photographers rushed forward. The simple moment needed no decoration. It represented everything the Learning Center hoped to become. A place where small acts of kindness would continue growing for generations. Years passed. The tiny seed slowly became a young tree. Children visited the Learning Center every afternoon to read books beneath its growing branches. Some completed homework while sitting in its shade. Others simply enjoyed listening to volunteers tell stories during the summer months. As the years continued, the tree grew taller and stronger, becoming one of the most recognizable parts of the Learning Center. Families often gathered beneath it during community events, and countless photographs were taken beside its wide trunk. Many visitors admired the beautiful tree without knowing why it had been planted there. Near its base stood a small bronze plaque. Visitors who stopped to read it found a simple message engraved into the metal. Asterisk, the greatest gifts are not the ones that cost the most. They are the ones that remind us we were never forgotten. Asterisk. Children often asked their parents what those words meant. Instead of giving short answers, parents shared stories about kindness, gratitude, and the importance of believing in people when they needed it most. Teachers brought students to the tree during school visits, encouraging them to think about how even the smallest act of compassion could change another person's future. Volunteers repeated the story to new generations, ensuring that Margaret's quiet legacy lived on not through monuments or wealth, but through ordinary people choosing to care for one another in ways that could never be measured by money. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next inspiring story. We'd also love to hear from you. What lesson did you learn from this story? And don't forget to tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from? We enjoy reading your comments and seeing viewers from all around the world. Remember, the greatest acts of kindness are often the quiet ones. A few kind words, a helping hand, or simply believing in someone can change a life forever. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep spreading kindness wherever you go, and we'll see you in the next story.